Hello everyone, I'm running a little bit late with my recording today. I do have an excuse, which is it's kind of a vaguely funny story. It's more of a rant, I guess. I recently bought a bike for my my wife. Oh dear. My wife for her birthday. And I went there to the shop and I got it and I brought it back and the gears didn't work. The gears, like the back gear, I could turn the thing, but it just wasn't having any effect on the actual, gears of the bike. So I was like, okay, I'll just, contact Halfords. Halfords is the shop that I bought it from. It's a popular, bike retailer in the UK. And weirdly, even though you'd think it would be quite common that someone would want to contact their specific local Halfords, because it doesn't really make much sense to contact, the main Halfords and say, hey, that bike I bought the other day? Because they'd be like, who are you? I'm some random person working in an, outsourced call center in South Asia or whatever. You'd think it would be obvious that sometimes you would want to have a specific person, who operates out of a specific Halfords, so that they can respond to people who specifically went into that shop, and thus obviously if they've got a problem with their bike they'll need to specifically return back to that shop. They don't have that as an option, but it did say on their website, most queries can be solved using our online chat thing. And sometimes I do find those online chat things are quite useful. I wish the NHS would have something like that. Because that's something I thought, sometimes just be like, hey, I've got this problem. Somebody, tells you on the other end, all right, whatever, we can fix it. Like Amazon's little chat thing I've usually found to be quite useful. But this one, it was insane because I said, it was a robot and it said, make sure you use very clear language. So I said, gears on my bike don't work. And they replied, prompting me with a whole load of options. I might even have it still up, actually. Let's see if I've got it. Yeah, okay. There's actually a link to do a review in terms of how satisfied I am. That is not going to be a very friendly review. Okay. Oh, you know what? It doesn't tell. Oh, they've covered their tracks quite well. They delete the options after I reject them. But they gave me a load of options that had nothing to do with a broken bike. It was something about buying an e-bike, a load of other things. And I was like, well, no, those don't help. And then they had the audacity to say, are you sure none of these are helpful? To which I obviously said, yes, I'm sure. And then they said, can I help you with anything else? Main menu, ask another question, chat with an agent, end chat. And it's so 3 out of 4 of those options are basically, hey, sorry, we couldn't help you with the one thing you said you wanted, which, by the way, you'd think would be a pretty common problem, like having something wrong with the bike. And they didn't even prompt me with anything like, the bike is faulty, or there's an issue with my bike. They didn't prompt me with anything like that, otherwise I would have clicked it. So, having completely failed to respond to this pretty obvious issue of something being faulty with the bike, they're then 3 out of 4 of the options are basically just moving on to something else. So obviously I clicked chat with an agent and I spoke to a guy, and then he was like, oh, you can book a bike checkup appointment. I think they even called it a bike health checkup appointment, at the local shop. And I was okay, that sounds kind of helpful. But the thing is, this isn't really a bike checkup thing. This is a thing of I bought the bike less than a week ago, and as soon as I got it home and started making sure it actually does work, I realized it doesn't work. So it's not really a bike checkup thing, really. It's more of a make the bike work in the first place situation. And then they were like, oh, well, in that case, you can just bring it back to the store. Which, fair enough, but I will be a bit annoyed if my ability to just bring it back to the store involves bringing it back to the store, but because I haven't contacted anyone in advance and haven't established a specific time for them to look at it, they will be like, oh, sorry, you got to stand around waiting in line for ages. So we'll see. It should be quite an easy thing to fix. I assume it's just connecting something or something, but obviously unacceptable. A while ago, I bought a bike for myself. I realized, so basically I decided to cycle it back home. And in the process of cycling it back home, I realized that there was an issue with it, and I ended up just returning it and getting a different bike instead. The problem with this, of course, is that, while I probably could, at a push, ride a bike for my wife, I probably wouldn't want to ride it. In fact, I did ride the bike for my wife a little bit because I wanted to actually make sure it works, but I could not have done that all the way back from the shop. Not to say the shop is insanely far away, but it's about 3 miles or so, which is quite a long time to cycle on a bike that is terrible. Just, didn't work. And that's why, and so essentially that whole contacting thing is what I was doing. To be fair, it only took a few, it didn't take as long as it might sound from it being quite a protracted story. Anyway, with all that said, just in case you're wondering, we do have 58 minutes left of my allotted responding time, and we are going to be responding to I'll just click off of Halfords, I'll click off of the football. That's another thing I had happen recently. I was watching, I watched the football with my family. Usually I watch the football on my own, on my laptop, but I watched with my family, and what happened is we were having dinner. So my dad paused the football and we had dinner. It was like a whole load it was about 10 people all told. It was like my family, but then some extended members of family as well. Just getting together to watch England, which is obviously the match that logically I would care a lot about. But we paused to go get dinner. So we got dinner and then we started playing again. And it was fine for a few minutes. And then it suddenly randomly decided to skip forward to catch up with the live version. So we went from the game being 0-0 to the game suddenly being 1-1. And we were like, oh, great. Okay, so it skipped to the bit where 2 goals were scored. Love that. Anyway, so I've actually decided to kind of rewatch a bit of that football match because I'm annoyed that I missed the best bits. But that's not been, don't worry, I wasn't doing that on your time. I wasn't doing that on my allotted responding time. I was doing that because I was cleaning my teeth, and sometimes if I'm cleaning my teeth or flossing my teeth, it's very easy, and in fact actually enables me to clean my teeth for a long period of time without getting bored, which is why my teeth are such pearly whites. Possibly I've got something in my mouth because I'm drinking my standard breakfast smoothie. But yeah, it's a very efficient system. I'd recommend it. Alright, so this video, we should get through this in one session, even though I've got less time to respond to it than I usually would have. 17 minutes, 13 seconds. I don't think we're going to be speeding it up. This person does have a very annoying voice. One thing I will say is it's kind of interesting that this even got recommended or voted through. In fact, I will actually just check that there hasn't been an overnight change in the poll, just because, I haven't checked. The poll ends only a few minutes before I start recording. So no, yeah, it's still comfortably ahead, which is interesting. 53% of the vote compared to 24% at the lowest alternative. What's interesting about it is that I have included this option of this video, do these 4 questions destroy gender ideology by the essence of thought. I have included it a few times before, and every single time I think it's ranked dead last, and I kind of found that weird because I was like, I feel like this could be an interesting video to respond to, so I was kind of surprised it was ranking dead last in the votes. But so this time I wasn't even going to include it, except for the fact there was one video that I thought I was going to include, but then I realized it was actually just a video I'd already responded to basically, and I just made a mistake. So then I got rid of that. I was like, I guess I might as well put the that video in there again, and I guess it's a good thing I did, because apparently you guys actually wanted to see it this time. So with that said, we are actually going to jump in now. Sorry if you didn't like this rant, but it's okay. Based on the fact I've got less time to actually respond in general, this should mean that the video ends up being a reasonable length, because I've got a huge rant at the beginning.
Is this the end for the trans community? Has this woman truly destroyed the gender ideology?
By the way, I should just say, in case you don't know, Essence of Thought is completely independent of trans ideology. A terrible person. There's lots of stories about Essence of Thought, like abusing people, bullying people, sending fans to harass people, things like that. Like this person, because there are a lot of trans activists who I think are perfectly nice people. Essence of Thought is not one of those people.
Am I out of the job? Not quite. Though before we discuss things further, quick content warning for the following. Transmisia, medical
Transmisia. I've never even heard of transmisia.
How can you say that you feel like a woman when you don't know what that feels like?
Off to a disappointing start. This is just a loaded question that asserts the conclusion the bigger...
Yeah, okay, you know what, I'd actually agree. So I suppose one of the things about this, and maybe a reason why you guys were right to, in the past, not rate this video very highly in terms of videos I should respond to, is, of course, that I am responding to somebody, which puts me in a situation of, do I necessarily agree with the arguments the person who's being responded to has made? My assumption was that they would be making good arguments, because I don't think it's that hard to destroy gender ideology. Having said that, I do think that argument was very poorly worded. I actually think this is quite a difficult argument to word, and I've seen it very effectively argued in a book I read. It was an actual proper book I read, because I remember I took a picture and I uploaded it to my Twitter one time, but unfortunately, it was ages ago, so I can't really remember what it said, but it was pretty much making this point that the issue is saying you feel like a woman and that's why you are a woman, or that evidences the idea you're a woman, is basically circular. Because ultimately, feeling like a woman should most properly be defined as the way somebody feels when they are a woman. And the thing that makes them a woman is being an adult human female. Saying, I feel like a woman, like it's kind of like the issue of like the male and female brains thing. Well, the thing that makes a brain female is being in a female body. So it's impossible that a female brain could exist in a male body, because, well, then it's not a female brain, is it? Essentially, all these arguments around feeling like a woman or having a female brain or whatever, they all rely on a circular begging the question style logic, where you're assuming that it's actually possible that a woman's mind can exist in a man. Well, obviously that's not possible, because then it's not a woman's mind. More generally, the issue is that if you're going to try to justify a claim about reality by referring to your internal sense of self, you run into the issue that you don't actually know what other people feel like. It's like saying, I feel like a woman makes no sense, because you don't know how any other person feels. You've just got some kind of vague vibes, and you're saying that you interpret those vibes as you feeling like a woman, but you don't actually know what it is to be a biological female, which is what a typical woman actually is. And I would argue all women actually are, but just to phrase it in a way that, of course, is not so, assuming my presumptions are correct. Certainly everyone would agree the typical woman is a biological female. Even Ethel, I think, would have to agree the typical woman is a biological female. Well, any biological male has no idea what the typical woman feels like. So and again, I don't really think there is one singular way the typical woman feels like. I think it's quite a reductive, offensive way to think about things anyway. But even if we were granting that and saying there is such a thing as like feeling like a woman, well, these people wouldn't actually know what that is. So I think that's the better way of phrasing it.
A trans woman has all the same cognitive faculties as you to figure out what it means to be a woman and whether they feel that way themselves.
Okay, that's a really weird way of phrasing it, because of course the problem is that women aren't claiming they have the cognitive faculties to figure out how it feels to be a woman. Women have the cognitive faculties to base their understanding of the world on objective, observable, material reality, and they recognize that what women share in common is something material, which is being biologically female. And then they know, well, okay, so I'm a woman based on that, and however I feel is how a woman feels. So they're not basing their claim to being a woman in being, or in feeling like a woman. They're basing their claim of being a woman in being biologically female, and then to the extent they would then say there is such a thing as feeling like a woman, that would be basically feeling how you feel as someone who recognizes the observable reality of being biologically female. The problem with saying, I know I kind of already addressed this, saying, well, I am this thing because I feel like this thing, is that you could only know what it feels like to be that thing if you are that thing. So you're kind of engaging in a circular argument. Like if I said, I am a black man because I feel like a black man, well, in order for me to know what it feels like to be a black man, I would have to be a black man in the first place, which of course is the thing I'm trying to defend.
Cis women are not part of some insect hive mind in which they share the same consciousness and compare notes on what it feels like to be a woman. You are just as alone as a trans woman on that question. Okay,
yeah, so basically making that point that, yeah, no woman can claim, well, I'm a woman because I know how every other woman feels, and I know I feel like them. That is a good point. But that's why it's good for nobody to base their claim of being a woman in that they feel like a woman. Because again, that is a contradict, or not, it's circular, right? I feel like a woman, and the reason I know what it feels like to be a woman is because I'm a woman, and the reason I'm a woman is because I feel like a woman. That's the issue. So, absolutely, yeah, if any biologically female woman said, well, I know how all women feel, that would be wrong. But the point is that a biological female doesn't need to say that she knows how all women feel in order to claim she feels like a woman. She can say, well, I know I'm a woman because I'm biologically female, and therefore certainly how I feel is the way at least one woman feels. It may not be how all women feel. And again, I think it's very legitimate to say there is no such thing as how all women feel.
With that said, we can observe what happens when you deny a person their gender, with such attempts targeted at trans youth increasing attempted suicide from a baseline of 5% to a whopping 57%.
Okay, now here's the massive issue of that, right? You're saying, well, we know that these people feel like women because when their gender is denied, they feel bad. Now, first of all, you're conflating being a woman with gender. The issue with that is, isn't gender like sexist stereotypes and gender roles and expectations? So you're conflating sexist stereotypes and traditional, gendered ideas of masculinity and femininity with being a woman. And that's issue number one. The other issue, of course, is that this would prove that, in fact, these people do not feel like women, because a lot of women who are denied their gender not only don't feel particularly bad about that, but certainly don't try to take their own lives. If you said, even women who do like presenting in a feminine way would almost certainly not be suicidal if they were not allowed to wear pink, for example. Okay, you're denying their gender, their feminine gender, but they're not going to try and take their own lives because of that. But putting that aside, so what that suggests in and of itself is that even when women do care about gender and do care about traditional femininity, and they might not want to have their gender repressed or denied, they're almost certainly not going to try to take their own life because of that. So that would suggest that the trans-identified males who would try to take their own life because of their gender being suppressed are suffering from some kind of unique mental health issue that does not, parallel women's experiences at all. But of course, then there's the other thing. Many women don't even want to perform femininity. So from their perspective, being denied their gender isn't going to be an issue at all. A tomboy who recognizes that she is a woman, but she wants to have short hair and, wear kind of more boyish outfits and whatever else. Denying her gender, well, I guess you get into the question of what even is her gender, because arguably her gender is masculine. But again, Ethel seems to be conflating here femininity with being a woman. So denying that person, that woman, the gender of femininity isn't going to cause her any issues at all. So in general, this idea that responding intensely negatively to not being allowed to perform as a woman and have the gender of being a woman, even though there is no such thing as a gender of being a woman, the idea that would prove that there is something authentic about the claim from trans-identified males that they feel like women, that's actually a very bad argument, because if anything, it shows that they don't feel like women. They feel the way that seemingly biological males with messed up ideas about gender roles and expectations would feel.
With cis intersex people, it's a little more difficult, as said torture is not typically seen as socially acceptable on them. I
need to stop. I need to have an opportunity of Ethel to stop saying stupid things so I can finish my smoothie. What do you mean that torture is not considered acceptable? It's frequent and common for biological males and biological females to have their gender denied. Indeed, because many biological males and biological females don't really perform gender or have very little interest in performing gender, and it wouldn't be considered that controversial at all. So that's just the opposite to the truth.
Yet, far from proving that gender could be socially taught, all Money managed to do was give David, a cis boy reassigned as a girl, gender dysphoria as you grew up to identify as a man.
Okay, so here's the issue with this. So this is something that a lot of people get wrong. This is something to watch out for. What he's doing here, or what Ethel's doing here, I'll try and do the pronoun thing, whatever, is taking the John Money experiment, which is basically John Money was trying to prove that, the idea of gender roles and things like that. And he kind of what you heard there, took this biological male and tried to raise him as a woman. And this eventually resulted in that biological male taking their own life. And trans activists will take this and they'll say, this proves that being raised in a way that is incongruent with your internal sense of self is incredibly psychologically damaging to somebody and would cause them to take their own life. Now, there are, I think, two issues with this. The first issue is you've got to ask, well, how did this biological male find themselves in this situation? And the answer is because they had their genitals mutilated when they were very young. Now, I think it's reasonable to say, first of all, that even though you're a baby, that could leave a massive traumatic impression on your early development. And that could explain coming to feel suicidal. But then also there's the fact that that's going to mess with your hormones. You know, people, I would imagine that, again, like maybe I could look into this, but I'm just going to say it's almost certainly true. Castrated individuals in general are likely to have more mental health issues simply because their hormones are going to be all over the place. And then you have the issue that these specific experiments that John Money performed, these trans activists will tell this story and they'll act as if it's just, oh, John Money just raised these people in a way that was incongruent with their, internal sense of self. And that's what caused them these issues. No, John Money basically sexually assaulted these kids. He forced children to perform incestuous sex acts with each other. It's just completely ridiculous and almost evil the way these people will look at this thing that happened where these children were basically tortured and say, and again, these children, first of all, they were mutilated, their genitals were mutilated, they were castrated. Imagine the impact that's going to have on children. And then forced into this, for their early lives to be a medical experiment, which is already pretty bad. And then, the specific experiments that were done involve looking at their sexuality by getting children to do these very overtly sexual things with each other. And then at the end of this, one of the children involved in this experiment as an adult went on to kill himself. And trans activists look at this and they say, see, this proves that raising somebody in a way that's incongruent with their internal sense of self when it comes to being a man or woman is clearly very mentally harmful to them. It's no, there's lots of other things happening there that were likely to be incredibly mentally harmful to them, and those are the issues. And indeed, a lot of those issues are things that are done to trans-identified children. So essentially, what these people can do is they can act as if, well, if you had the exact same situation of a child's genitals being mutilated, being castrated, being experimented on by the medical establishment, but we affirmed their internal sense of being a man or woman or boy or girl, then they would be completely fine. And of course, that's what they want to conclude because that's what they're basically pushing for. In reality, of course, such a person would almost certainly not be completely fine.
Why is gender everything but also nothing?
I'll take shit.
Obviously, I've still had plenty to respond to from this video, but I do have to say these arguments that are supposed to be destroying gender ideology, they're not very good. Even if I could unpack what's that saying there, how is gender everything but also nothing? I guess what's being said there is why is it that gender is this completely plastic thing that you can change at will, but it's also something so important and innate that it really matters that we respect it. Well, that's how you should phrase it then. You shouldn't just say, how is it gender is everything but also nothing? Let's see what... I'm kind of surprised this person actually takes, 3.5 minutes to respond to this, because I'd be if I heard a trans activist say something equivalent to that, I'd be like, what the hell are you saying? Actually communicate with proper sentences that communicate the point you're trying to make instead of just saying something cryptic.
We are on about gender identity. That is the psychological component of sex. It is an individual's evolved perception of themselves in relation to others in their social group.
Okay, so there he's defining gender. I'm not really going to respond to it because I don't think that's relevant. Essentially, the question is, can Ethel explain why it is that trans activists consider gender to be really important in some situations and not important at all in other situations. That's really going to be, unless there's something unrelated or tangentially related that's really stupid that's said that's worth responding to, I'm only going to respond to anything said. So there might be all sorts of definitions of gender, and I could pause and quibble those definitions. But what really matters is, can there be offered up a definition of two different types of gender that can explain this inconsistency between gender being incredibly important, but also something that is completely plastic and basically you can just say it, and in saying it, you declare it to be true.
That is gender identity, at least in a relatively condensed form. From this we get gender expression, that is how the individual seeks to express their gender identity to others.
Okay, this slightly annoys me. I'm going to pause just because this bothers me. These people say that, like, gender expression extends from gender identity. They have no concept of patriarchy and the reality that gender expression, meaning masculinity and femininity, was imposed on people as an oppressive system. Like, genuinely, the argument we just got there was gender identity evolved from people being like able to just think of themselves however they wanted to be, and from that came gender expression. Of course, that's not true. The expectation that men and women dress a certain way, or that even like third genders are expected to dress and behave a certain way, that didn't come from people's innate sense of gender identity. It came from an oppressive system of arbitrary social categorization.
When it comes to norms and stereotypes, however, they're nothing to me. In fact, they're worse than nothing. They're a negative.
They're worse than nothing. They're nothing. That's what you get for not being able to say the word nothing properly. So essentially the argument there is that the reason why it's sometimes everything and sometimes nothing is because it's nothing if it is the sociologically expected performance of gender, but it's everything if it is your own internal sense of gender, which I can sort of understand. The only issue of that is, obviously, I think most people recognize that when it comes to gender expression, you can't detach that from the socially imposed and expected expression. What is masculinity if not a stereotype and an artificially imposed norm? And yet, for most people, masculinity and femininity is going to be what gender is. Like, I don't think we could understand ContraPoints' gender expression in any way being detached from the sexist aspects of gender stereotypes and gendered expectation. And in general, this kind of distinction between your internal sense being what matters, but societal expectations not mattering at all, and that being why there is this distinction between gender meaning everything or indeed nothing. The problem with that is it is failing to understand that we are social species, and what happens around us has an impact on us. It's not just something we can ignore and, you know, rise above and just be kind of our own islands, basically.
And if gender and sex are completely different, then how is a sex change gender reaffirming surgery?
Yeah, pretty good point. A lot of trans activists, they make a big point about saying gender and sex are distinct, and yet they will frequently say, like, in their language, they will conflate those two things. I think that is a legitimate criticism and reasonably well stated. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm being like patronizing here by saying like, oh, reasonably well stated. I'm just saying like, yeah, I've already communicated, I think, that this TikTok that's being responded to here is not the most perfectly worded argument against trans identity, but I think that was pretty well done.
I think you mean gender affirming surgery, not reaffirming. I think you got it confused with genital reconstructive surgery.
Well, isn't a lot, like in a lot of contexts, aren't affirmation and reaffirmation pretty much the same thing?
All humans are primates, not all primates are humans. All gender is sex, not all sex is gender.
Is that what you're saying? All gender is sex, not all sex is gender. That almost seems like the opposite to how I would phrase it. But there you're saying, that doesn't really make any sense to me. All gender is sex. So wearing a dress is sex? Like, that seems like the most insane level of gender essentialism. I can't believe that's unironically being espoused as a viewpoint, that all gender is sex. Like, I can't think of what that could possibly mean other than just, yeah, pure gender essentialism. Literally being biologically female can be conflated with gender roles, gender expectations.
Hormones, genitals, and secondary sexual characteristics are things we have complete control over. Meanwhile, when it comes to gametes, they're almost obsolete at this point. The only thing left are chromosomes, which...
Okay, so look, I'm not really going to respond to this too much. Basically, it's this thing, it's the main argument trans activists make when they ever try to sound scientific, where they basically fail to understand that biological classification and science in general needs to be done holistically with a mind towards wider function, rather than what they frequently do, which is act as if it is a checklist. It's similar, okay, they're both like annoying things leftists do. So this is going to sound like a complete aside, but I do want to make it as a point. It's similar to the 14 defining points of fascism. So I don't know if you know about this, but there was a guy, I think his name was Umberto Eco, something like that. He wrote 14 things that he says, this is what makes something fascist. And the problem is people treat it like a checklist, right? So it's like, it's got that, and that makes it like 50% fascist or whatever else. But the problem there is that fascism is it's a complete system with an underpinning philosophy and a way of viewing the world. And to basically just treat it as a checklist where it's like, you've got nationalism. That makes you makes you X% fascist. And you've got a strong, support for the military. That makes you, no, it's about, like I say, an underlying ideology that is, much more holistic and much more all-encompassing that underpins fascism. And in the exact same sense, biological sex is not a checklist. It's not, you have slightly larger feet than average. Okay, that makes you a male. Oh, you have testicles. That's a tick for the male. It's not a checklist. It's about a complete system, a system organized around facilitating the function of certain gametes in sexual reproduction. So, there, I think it was just said, I'm just trying to think about when I would have paused and exactly what you would have seen being said. But one of the things I think you saw was claiming that gametes are basically irrelevant. Well, in some, yeah, sure. I mean, they're irrelevant in that the actual nature of the gametes themselves doesn't exactly matter, but they're incredibly relevant in that the entire system of biological sex is organized around the role of those gametes in sexual reproduction. That's the reason why biological sex exists. If it weren't for the nature of sperm and every single thing that sperm needs to do, my body would be wildly different. Everything about my biological sex relates to, apart from, the occasional differences of sexual development where maybe it's not functioning as well as it should be. Because again, just because something's organized around a function doesn't mean it's perfectly organized around that function. A car might be organized around the function of driving to different places, but that doesn't mean it's going to be optimally designed in the most aerodynamic way possible and things like that. And it doesn't mean there aren't going to be compromises that have to be made. Like you might make a more comfortable car that's less fancy looking or whatever else, or more economical and things like that. It's the exact same with our body. No one's claiming that it's perfectly organized around facilitating the function. That's of course why sometimes people even end up infertile. But the broad I was going to say the broad strokes, I guess is a good way of saying it. The broad strokes of my body are organized around clearly facilitating the function of the small gamete in sexual reproduction. But again, it's just this massive error. Of course, the argument there is basically to say, well, once we employ this checklist thing, we then see that, we a lot of people might not fit all of the check marks for certain physical indicators of biological sex. And therefore, if we say that another aspect of biological sex is one's mental state, which then relates it to their internal sense of self and the kind of desired role they want to perform in society, then we can say, hey, why don't we just consider that to be something that determines their biological sex? And that's how we end up saying that trans-identified males are in fact female, which is, I guess, what this person's arguing.
It's because a person undergoing GRS isn't changing their sex, they're merely altering their physiological attributes to better match or affirm their pre-existing psychological sex.
Okay, so look, I will say this. I actually think all else aside, and there were a few things said there which I could have nitpicked, but again, I do want to finish this video, and we have, not that long, like not even quite 20 minutes to finish it. And we've got 7 minutes left to get through. Oh god. So that's why I've kind of let some things play. But I will say that's actually, it's a good response. I do think that I can understand the logic of saying, well, your gender is something kind of sociological and mental, but it relates in a very direct sense to your biological sex. I can understand somebody saying that, and therefore part of affirming your gender would be changing your biological sex because you perceive your biological sex to relate to your gender in that your gender is your feelings about those things. So, for example, if you were to say that one aspect of the female gender is wanting boobs, then you could therefore say, well, if you get a surgery that, gives you boobs, that is gender affirming, right? Now, the issues there is, first of all, is that incredibly sexist? Yes. Second of all, not every single trans ideologue would believe that. So this is kind of a case of a trans person with a specific conception of trans ideology being able to defend an argument that's clearly directed against the people who would argue that you can have your gender identity completely independent of your biological sex. So, for example, the people who say, like, how I look with he, him in my bio, and it's literally, like, just someone who looks completely like a woman. Or the people who say, like, having massive boobs doesn't at all contradict my, sense of being a man. So, like, the kind of trans-identified females. Or the trans-identified females who get pregnant. And of course, the joke is, how can you say that somebody calling you she, her is, failing to affirm your masculine gender identity, and yet giving birth isn't? Well, yeah, there are apparently some people out there who think that they can identify as a man and yet be pregnant and give birth, and they don't see a contradiction there. So for those people, it's pretty obvious that there is no connection between the reality of biological sex and their sense of gender, and therefore for those people clearly sex change wouldn't be gender affirming care. Having said that, I could understand someone saying, well, sure, but we call it gender affirming care because for the people who are interested in it, they're usually going to be doing it because it relates in some way to their expectations about their own body, which they perceive to be derived from their priorities when it comes to their own gender identity and gender expression. So I can understand that, and to be fair, that is, I think, a reasonable response. Well done, Ethel Thurston.
And why are the gay community and the trans community all in one?
Because
I assume the original TikTok may not have been claiming that it was able to destroy trans ideology or gender ideology, and that's just something that, like, people have added on top. Like, maybe somebody tweeted, like, this woman destroys gender ideology. Because, that's a pretty tame question. Like, I think it's an important question because there isn't any reason why somebody's sexual attraction should be related to somebody's sense of being a biological male a man or woman contrary to the reality of their biological sex. Those two things are clearly very different. But asking that question certainly doesn't destroy trans ideology. We'll see how much I have to say in response to this.
Allo-cis-het people didn't care if a person was gay or trans, they just saw a dirty degenerate who needed to be exterminated.
Okay, that's a bad argument though, because just, like, one, letting yourself be grouped together by the people who hate you seems kind of dumb, because you're kind of legitimizing, like, essentially what you're saying there is, these people just lumped us together, so we're gonna lump ourselves together. But the point is, them lumping you together was born out of their own ignorance. So you're essentially saying, well, we're going to actually look to their ignorance as being valid and something to accept and embrace in how we define ourselves. And it's like, I just don't think that makes much sense. Now, sometimes, like, for example, with a word, I can understand, gay people, if they want to, reclaiming the word queer, for example. Again, I personally think the word queer has kind of, been corrupted for other reasons now. I don't really want to get into it, but I can understand the logic of black people reclaiming the N-word and lesbians reclaiming the D word. Not that D word, not the D word that trans-identified males would like them to be reclaiming. But in this case, again, literally the grouping together is 100% born out of ignorance, and an ignorance that is incredibly offensive of just, well, these people are a bunch of weirdos, so let's group them together. And then, so literally what you're saying there is you're kind of admitting the reason why trans ideology or trans identity and same-sex attraction is grouped together is because, well, they're just a bunch of weirdos. You're saying, well, we group ourselves together because that's what the people who hate us think about us. But ultimately you're admitting, therefore, the reason for it is, well, they're just a bunch of weirdos.
In fact, one of the earliest contemporary LGBT plus communities to form was in 1920s Berlin, surrounding the Institute of Sex Research, founded by Jewish sexologist Magnus Hirsch.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so that's the thing. And I guess, to be fair, this functions as a good argument. The answer to the question, I suppose, is history. But given what we know about that history, and in fact we know this is basically just about a bunch of people saying, well, biological males identifying as women and biological males having sex with other biological males, aren't both those things just a bunch of weirdos? Isn't just a bunch of like weird freaks? So, let's just group them together because they're a bunch of weirdos and they're just strange and different. Considering that's what we know the history is based in, why should we continue to uphold that? That's the, I think, more legitimate question.
And it's that idea of sexual reform that encompasses both sexuality and gender nonconformity.
I understand the idea that in some contexts we would group together LGB and T. Like, I think that does make sense. Because, yes, in some contexts, we can just say, well, insofar as there is like a gender, sex, sexuality continuum, LGB and T can be grouped together as people on that continuum who are just different from the average, different from the norm. And in some contexts, there is room for a broad advocacy just for anybody who would be seen to be, kind of weird and different. But it's something which, again, as we become more nuanced and kind of, I guess, enlightened on a wider societal level about the reality of how these things are different, we should move away from that, right? Like, yes, when the world was very kind of bigoted and it was simplistic and it was just a case of, they're a bunch of weirdos, who cares? Yeah, I can understand all the quote-unquote weirdos just grouping together. But as things get better, it's obvious that what's going to start to matter more is the specific nuances and specific needs of these different groups. And that's going to involve having their own advocacy. And I think it's insane that right now, simply just saying, well, I'm pro-LGB and I care about advocating for same-sex attraction is seen to be bigoted because you're not including the trans identity issue.
Bigots do not care if you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. They are coming for all of us.
Okay, here's the interesting thing, right? By saying that, you are admitting that gender-critical people like me are not bigots necessarily, because you're saying bigots do not care if you are LGB or T, they're coming for all of us. So that means LGB people can't be bigots, right? But it also means somebody like me, I can't be a bigot, because I'm not coming for LGB people. I do care whether the distinction is whether someone's a biological male claiming to be a woman, which is nonsense, or simply a biological male who's attracted to other biological males, which is frankly none of my business, and all power to them, I say. So, yeah, you're literally admitting there in saying that I'm not a bigot. And that anybody who has an issue with trans identity, but does not have those same issues with people being LGB because they are fundamentally different things, is not a bigot. So it's nice to see you admitting that.
That's why the LGBT plus community stands united. That is the power of the union. You support me, I support you, whoever you are.
No, see, the problem with that is, that works until you get bad people involved. And let's not forget that the gay rights movement, for a long time, NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, was literally part of that gay movement. And it was a mainstream part of the gay movement. So clearly, gay people have already realized this problem, right? Because there was once a time when pedophiles walked up to the gay rights movement and said, you support me and I'll support you and we'll both advance our rights. And some gay people in the gay rights movement early on said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And thankfully, there are a lot of gay people who've now realized That's not a good thing to do. And there are many gay people who absolutely repudiate those evil aspects of the early gay rights movement and how they did ally with paedophile rights movements. So clearly, what matters, you say, it's great to have solidarity, and, I don't think every single person should just be an individualist out for themselves. There's a lot to be said for you support me, I'll support you. But it matters a lot that the person with whom you've made this deal actually has a legitimate goal. And in the case of pedophiles, that certainly wasn't true. And I think it's also not true in the case of trans activists. That is very important. I think that the gay rights movement is a legitimate movement, but they have, in the past, made the mistake of allying with other much less legitimate movements. So, thankfully, many of them are resistant to making that same mistake when it comes to trans identity.
So I finished writing my script when Pinkworld Comics released this piece, perfectly demonstrating what I've just explained. This is how the LGBT...
See, okay, look, this comic is complete nonsense because it's saying all of you are degenerates and then saying, why stick together? You're all so different. I even tolerate some of you. Here's the issue with that, right? Nobody is fitting those two things, right? Like, I would not say that lesbians, gays, and bisexuals are all degenerates. But I would say, why stick together? You're all so different. And never mind tolerate. I mean, I think, it's fine. But I can't think of anyone who'd say, you're all degenerates, and then say sincerely, hey, why are you sticking together? There's many differences between you. Like, this is one of those arguments where it's just like an inability to understand that just because you've heard two things at once, it doesn't mean those two things were coming from the same people who were contradictory. Nonsense.
This also acts as a good indicator of just how intellectually bankrupt the anti-trans movement is. That they're having to rely on the same rhetorical devices as frequented by evangelicals and young earth creation.
I don't really know what you're saying at the same time. Like, what you're saying is somebody with a TikTok account made 4 arguments that were basically 4 very short sentences. Like, anyone can do that. And somebody could also make an incredibly long argument. I would say that the length of arguments is neither here nor there. What matters more is the quality. And I don't think you can say, well, they're bankrupt because they made short arguments. And also some Christians or evangelical Christian creationists make short arguments. That's not really a meaningful association or connection. I think I'm just going to say, because it's kind of the point where I want to finish, I'm just going to imagine that the last, minute and a bit is not going to be important. So I will just say that I actually don't think that there was any destruction there. I don't think that what the arguments made were the strongest arguments. The strongest argument, I think, is the transracial analogy, definitely. But with that said, I think Ethel's definitely still said some incorrect things, some things where it was quite easy to point out the error in that argumentation. So that was enjoyable, and I'm glad that we're able to get through all of it. Finishing a little bit early, probably, because like I say, I had my whole Halford situation going on. But I guess, just for now, I will go away and say I hope you enjoyed this. And remember, of course, there will be a vote next week on what video you'd like me to respond to, so be sure to let me know any videos that you happen to see that you would be interested in seeing my thoughts on, and I will see you all, I guess tomorrow actually will be when my videos uploaded on my main channel, but on here, on Patreon, I'll see you all next week. Bye!